The house was unusually quiet that January evening. It was a silence that seemed to accentuate the ticking of the clock in the living room, each tick echoing in the stillness. My husband, as usual, was splayed out on the couch, the glow of the television dancing across his face. He grunted occasionally, half-heartedly reacting to whatever sportscaster droned on. This was his kingdom. The couch, the remote, the predictable rhythm of a life that hadn't shifted in years. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the simmering pot of soup on the stove, the warmth from it a small comfort against the chill outside. But my thoughts weren't on the soup or the cold. They were on my son, Derek. He had left for work hours ago, and I found myself glancing at the clock more than I cared to admit. At 42, I was aware of how much my world had shrunk. My husband, Harold, had settled comfortably into his routines, his ambitions fading into the background. Meanwhile, Derek had grown into a man I could hardly recognize as the little boy who once clung to my hand at the park. At 23, he was strong, confident, and far more focused than I could have imagined. He'd carved out a life for himself as a gym trainer, his days filled with people seeking strength and transformation. I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and something else, something I couldn't quite name. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my reverie. Derek's voice called out, "Mom, I'm back." I turned, my lips already curving into a smile as I saw him walk into the kitchen. He carried an air of energy that seemed to fill the room, shaking off the winter chill like it was nothing. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his dark hair still damp from what I assumed was a post-work shower at the gym. "Hey," I said softly, ladling soup into a bowl. "Long day." "You could say that." He grinned, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "Clients have their New Year's resolutions, so the gym's been packed." I placed the bowl in front of him, and as he began to eat, I found myself watching him. His movements were deliberate, his posture confident. He looked so much like his father used to when we first met, young, full of life. But Derek's presence was different. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that spoke of the man he had become. "You work too hard," I said, leaning against the counter. He looked up at me, his dark eyes meeting mine. "It's not work if you love what you do. Besides, it keeps me out of trouble." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're just like your father used to be." His smile faded slightly, and he set his spoon down, his gaze turning thoughtful. "Dad and we're not that alike, Mom." The statement hung in the air, unspoken truths filling the silence between us. He wasn't wrong. Harold's vitality had dimmed over the years, replaced by complacency. Derek, on the other hand, was a flame, bright, determined, and impossible to ignore. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But you're both stubborn. You've got that in common." He chuckled, his easy grin returning. "Fair enough." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, work, the gym, and his plans for the week. But even as we talked, I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me, his gaze lingering longer than usual. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, but it stirred something within me, a warmth, a flicker of life that had been dormant for far too long. As Derek finished his soup and leaned back in his chair, he stretched his arms over his head, his muscles taut under his sweater. He caught me looking and raised an eyebrow, his grin playful. "What's up?" "Nothing," I said quickly, turning back to the sink to rinse the dishes. "Just thinking about how proud I am of you." He was quiet for a moment, and when I turned back around, he was standing behind me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. His touch was warm, grounding. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." I smiled up at him, my heart aching with the bittersweet realization of how much he had grown. "You've come a long way, Derek." "So have you," he said, his voice softer now. "You've always been there for me. I don't think I've told you enough how much that means." His words caught me off guard, a lump forming in my throat. "You don't have to, sweetheart. That's what mothers are for." But as he pulled me into a gentle hug, I realized that what he had given me tonight, a moment of connection, a reminder of love, was far more than I had ever expected. It was a flicker of something I thought I had lost long ago. And in that embrace, I felt a warmth that melted the frost of January, if only for a little while. Derek offered me a private training session at home. But I said I didn't have any special clothes. He said it wasn't a problem, that I had a gift waiting for me tomorrow. The next morning I found a neatly wrapped package waiting for me on the dining table. Derek was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I walked in, his face breaking into that effortless grin of his. "Morning, Mom," he said, gesturing toward the package. "That's for you." "What's this?" I asked, eyeing the box suspiciously. He shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, though the excitement in his eyes gave him away. "Just a little something to help you get started. You said you didn't have the right clothes, so I figured I'd fix that." I opened the box carefully, peeling away the wrapping paper to reveal a pair of sleek, black sports leggings and a matching top. The material was soft and stretchy, clearly high quality. "Derek," I said, holding up the set, "this looks expensive." He waved off my concern. "You deserve nice things, Mom. Besides, it's an investment in your health." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. "You really didn't have to go all out like this." "I wanted to," he said simply, his voice steady, almost matter-of-fact. "You've done so much for me over the years. Let me take care of you for a change." His words hit me harder than I expected, leaving me momentarily speechless. I could feel the sincerity in his tone, the quiet determination to show his gratitude in the only way he knew how. "Well," I said finally, clearing my throat, "I guess I have no excuse now, do I?" He chuckled, taking a long sip of his coffee. "Oh, be ready at 5. We're starting with the basics." The hours slipped by, and I found myself both nervous and excited about Derek's promise of a training session. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I had changed into the leggings and top, feeling slightly self-conscious as I glanced at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The outfit fit perfectly, hugging my frame in a way that made me feel oddly confident. Derek was already setting up in the living room, having pushed aside the coffee table to make space. He'd laid out a yoga mat and a pair of light dumbbells, his energy infectious as he adjusted the positioning of everything. "You look great, Mom," he said as I walked in, his eyes lighting up. "Flattery will get you nowhere," I teased, though I couldn't help the small blush creeping up my cheeks. He laughed, gesturing for me to join him on the mat. "Let's start with some stretches. I'll guide you through it." The session began simply enough. Basic stretches, a few squats, and some light arm exercises. Derek was patient, correcting my posture gently when I faltered. He stood behind me at times, his hands on my shoulders or hips to guide my movements. "That's perfect," he said, his voice warm and encouraging. "You're stronger than you think, Mom." I found myself smiling despite the mild ache in my muscles. There was something about his presence, his unwavering support, that made me feel lighter, more capable. When I struggled with a particular exercise, Derek was quick to step in, wrapping his arms around me to help me complete the motion. His hands were firm yet gentle, his voice a steady stream of reassurance. "See, you've got this," he said, his breath brushing against my ear. "You're doing amazing." By the end of the session, I was out of breath but filled with a strange sense of accomplishment. Derek handed me a towel, his hand brushing against mine as he did so. "You did great," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm proud of you." The words carried a weight I hadn't expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. It wasn't just the workout or the praise, it was the way he looked at me, with genuine admiration and care. "Thank you, Derek," I said softly, clutching the towel. He stepped closer, pulling me into a warm hug. His arms enveloped me, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the embrace, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat grounding me. "You've always been there for me," he murmured. "It's my turn now." The sound of a beer can cracking open broke the moment, and I glanced over to see Harold sprawled on the couch, a football game playing loudly on the TV. He barely acknowledged us, his attention fixed on the screen. Derek pulled back, his smile soft but knowing. You deserve this, Mom. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. As I watched Derek gather up the equipment, I realized how much his presence had come to mean to me. He wasn't just my son. He was my anchor, my confidant, and, though I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud, the reminder of a life that still had room for connection, for care, for something more. And as he left the room to put away the dumbbells, I found myself looking forward to our next session, not just for the exercise, but for the quiet moments of warmth and understanding that had become so rare in my life. After the workout, I flopped down onto the couch, still catching my breath. Derek came back into the room with his usual energy, a playful grin on his face. How about we refuel with something healthy? He suggested, leaning against the doorway. What did you have in mind? I asked, still wiping my face with the towel he'd given me. A smoothie, he said, clapping his hands together. Trust me, it'll be delicious. You'll feel like a new woman. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself following him into the kitchen, curious to see what he had planned. He pulled out an assortment of ingredients: spinach, frozen berries, almond milk, bananas, and some kind of protein powder I'd never heard of. You're going to love this, he said, already slicing the banana with practiced ease. I watched as he worked, his movements sure and efficient. You've really got this down to a science, I teased, stepping closer to grab the blender from the cabinet. It's all about balance, he replied, tossing the fruit into the blender with a flourish. Good nutrition is just as important as exercise. As the blender roared to life, he turned to me, his grin softening into something warmer. Thanks for trusting me with this, Mom. I laughed. Well, you're the expert, apparently. Once the smoothies were ready, we sat at the kitchen island, sipping the thick, sweet drinks. Derek watched me carefully as I took the first sip. Good, right? He asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Really good, I admitted, savoring the burst of flavors. He smiled satisfied. Great. Now how about a walk? There's still a little daylight left, and it's not too cold. A walk sounded nice. The house felt stifling sometimes, especially with Harold glued to the couch, oblivious to everything around him. Sure, I said, setting my glass down. The woods near our house had always been a peaceful retreat, but I hadn't been there in years. Derek walked beside me, his stride easy and unhurried as we followed the narrow dirt trail. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, and the fading light of the winter sun cast long shadows through the trees. Derek slowed his pace, letting his shoulder brush against mine gently. You're quiet, he said, glancing at me with concern. Just taking it all in, I replied softly. He nodded, then stopped, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding me in the moment. I'm glad you came out here with me. Before I could respond, he leaned down and kissed my cheek lightly. It was a fleeting gesture, yet it carried an unexpected tenderness that left me momentarily speechless. You've been doing so much for everyone else, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You deserve moments like this. I didn't know what to say. Derek had a way of seeing through me, of cutting through the layers I'd built over the years. As we walked further, he broke the silence again. Mom, he started, his tone hesitant. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, glancing at him. How are things with Dad? His question was gentle, but it hit me like a weight. I sighed, looking ahead at the trail. They're fine, I said, though even I didn't believe it. Are they? He pressed, his voice careful but insistent. I stopped walking, turning to face him. Why are you asking me this, Derek? He ran a hand through his hair, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because I see how much you give, Mom, and I see how little he gives back. You deserve more than that. I swallowed hard, his words striking a chord I hadn't dared to confront. Derek, it's not that simple. Marriage isn't easy. And your dad, he's not a bad man. He's just Complacent, Derek finished for me, his gaze unwavering. He doesn't see you the way he should. And that's not fair to you. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. You don't understand, Derek. It's complicated. He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Maybe it is. But you shouldn't have to settle for less than you deserve. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth. I felt the weight of them, the way they echoed thoughts I'd buried deep down. Have you thought about leaving him? He asked gently, his eyes searching mine. I shook my head, the very idea too overwhelming to consider. Derek, I don't know. After so many years, it feels impossible. It's not impossible, he said softly. Hard maybe, but not impossible. And you wouldn't be alone. I'd be here every step of the way. The conviction in his voice stirred something in me, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a different life waiting for me, a life where I wasn't just existing but living. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He pulled me into a warm embrace, his arms strong and reassuring. You're stronger than you think, Mom, he murmured. And you deserve to be happy. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of possibility. Derek's words lingered in my mind as we continued our walk, the woods around us quiet but alive with the promise of change. Derek's suggestion caught me off guard. As we reached the edge of the woods, the streetlights flickering on in the early evening gloom, he turned to me with a grin that was both charming and earnest. Let's not go home yet, he said. How about we grab something to eat? My treat. I hesitated, glancing down at my leggings and top. Derek, I can't go out like this. I look a mess. He stepped closer, his expression softening. Mom, you're beautiful, he said firmly. It doesn't matter what you're wearing. Come on, let me spoil you a little. His words, spoken with such sincerity, left me with no room to argue. I smiled despite myself, nodding. All right, but nothing too fancy. We found a cozy little cafe on the corner of the main street, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk like an invitation. Derek held the door open for me, and as I stepped inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods enveloped me. The place was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered at tables. Derek led me to a booth by the window, his hand lightly brushing my back as he guided me to my seat. Sit tight, he said, his eyes sparkling. I'll handle everything. As he walked to the counter, I found myself watching him. There was an ease to the way he moved, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance. He was attentive, kind, and so different from his father. He returned with a tray, setting down 2 steaming bowls of soup and a basket of crusty bread. I figured something warm and hearty would hit the spot, he said, sliding into the seat across from me. It's perfect, I said, the tension from earlier melting away as I took a sip of the rich, savory broth. Derek watched me, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I like seeing you like this. Like what? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Relaxed. Happy. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. You deserve more of that. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that struck deep. As we finished our meal, I glanced toward the counter and hesitated. Maybe we should take something home for Harold, I suggested. Derek's smile faltered, but he nodded. If that's what you want, sure. By the time we got home, the house was dimly lit, the sound of the TV echoing faintly from the living room. Harold was in his usual spot, sprawled on the couch with a beer in hand, his gaze fixed on the screen. Harold, I called softly, holding up the bag with his portion of food. We brought you something from the cafe. He barely glanced in my direction, his hand reaching out absently as if I were a waiter delivering a bill. Just put it on the table, he muttered. I stood there for a moment, the bag in my hand growing heavier with each passing second. Derek was behind me, his presence steady, silent. Harold, I tried again, my voice firmer this time. I said we brought you something to eat. Yeah, he replied, waving me off without even turning his head. Something inside me snapped. Years of neglect, indifference, and being treated as if I were invisible boiled over in an instant. Before I could think better of it, I strode into the living room and dropped the food squarely in his lap. "What the hell, Nancy?" Harold barked, jerking upright as the container tumbled onto the floor. I didn't flinch. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of clarity and strength. "That's it," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Harold, we're getting a divorce." His mouth opened as if to protest, but nothing came out. He stared at me, stunned, while I turned on my heel and walked back into the kitchen where Derek stood waiting. He stepped forward, his arms wrapping around me in a firm, reassuring embrace. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he murmured. "You deserve so much better than this." Tears blurred my vision, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of release, of liberation. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, the promise of a new beginning on the horizon. "Thank you, Derek," I whispered, my voice muffled against his chest. "You're not alone," he said, his hand smoothing over my hair. "I'll be here for you every step of the way." As I looked up at him, his expression filled with unwavering support, I knew I had made the right decision. This wasn't just about Harold. It was about reclaiming my life, my happiness. And Derek was my anchor, my reminder of the strength I thought I'd lost. Together we would face whatever came next. And for the first time in years I felt ready.